The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 2, Reading and Viewing. It addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to explore and explain key features of texts and how they contribute to meaning.
Hello again, my name is Charlotte. In this series of lessons, we are taking an introductory look at poetry. So far, we have investigated the historical development of poetry. In this lesson, we will look at the difference between poetry and prose. And once you know what a poem should consist of, I will give you some hints that will help you to write your own poetry. Now let's start this lesson with a question. What is the difference between poetry and prose? There are certain characteristics specific to poetry. So if you have ever wondered whether a piece of writing is poetry or prose, here are the 5 distinguishing characteristics of poetry: attentiveness, concentration, experimentation, originality, and form. Writing a poem is a deliberate process, and poetry aims to create an intense emotional experience or to draw attention to something. Now we are going to take a look at each of these 5 characteristics of poetry in greater detail. We will start with attentiveness. Poets pay a great deal of attention to the way in which they use language. Every piece of punctuation, every word used, every idea is carefully sculpted so that you can understand exactly what the poet is trying to say. There is no guesswork or luck involved in writing poetry. Poets can spend months writing a poem. Don't think that they pick up a pen or sit in front of a keyboard and the words just flow from their fingers. Poetry involves a lot of editing and altering for the poet to find the exact effect that he or she is looking for. The next characteristic we will be looking at is concentration. Now, by concentration, we do not mean the way you need to concentrate when you are in class or when you are writing an exam paper. But we do mean the way that poets use as few words as possible to express the greatest of meaning, emotions, and experiences. Now, if you had to write down in normal prose all that is being said in a poem, you will soon realize that what you are writing is a lot longer than the original poem. Now, the next characteristic that we are looking at is experimentation. Poets use language in new, surprising, and challenging ways. Now, you might have heard people joke about poetic license. This is the term used to explain the unusual way in which poets sometimes express themselves. Poets do not always stick to the rules of grammar and spelling, but it is not because they do not know it. It is because they are trying to make a point or are experimenting with a new way of using language. Another key characteristic of poetry is originality. Poetry expresses ideas in new and refreshing ways and does not rely on old concepts. Originality is an important element in poetry, and as you know, in all creativity. Prose is usually written in sentences and paragraphs, but a poet can express his originality by changing the form of a poem. That leads us to the final characteristic of poetry that we will be looking at today: form. This refers to the shape of a poem. While other writing usually starts at one margin and ends at the next, poetry is instantly recognizable because it does not look like a paragraph. Poetry can be written in various forms, like a prayer, an ode, or a sonnet, and we will be looking at some of these examples in later lessons. Some poems are even written in the shape of their subject matter. Look at this example. A poem about a swan, like this one by John Hollander, is written in the shape of a swan to emphasize the poet's message. It is important to note that poetry is a creative art and is seldom predictable. The beauty of poetry is that it has a slightly different impact on every person that is exposed to it because it is intensely personal. Now let's quickly recap the 5 characteristics of poetry: attentiveness, concentration, experimentation, originality, and form. Are you beginning to understand that nothing in a poem is accidental? Every word, every punctuation mark should be used with a purpose. Now, most of you have probably written some poetry for yourself. Often, we write poetry on impulse when we are depressed or angry about something. We often use poetry as a therapist to get rid of negative emotion. What we need to remember is the stimulus for a poem. You may wonder what a stimulus is. Well, the stimulus is the motivation or reason for writing a poem. Also remember that every poem has a message. That is, something specific which the poet wants to communicate. Don't just sit down and try and write a poem if you have no idea what you want to say. If you do this, your reader will have no idea what you mean. We are going to take the 5 characteristics of poetry that we have discussed earlier and apply them in order to help us to write a poem of our own. Now, while I'm going through this exercise, try and keep up by using your own idea. Now, let's start by choosing a topic. The first step is to write down a straightforward statement. Think of something that you would like to express. You may want to write about how you feel uneasy when there's a thunderstorm, or how you love being young and carefree, or a painful memory or a special moment in your life. I choose to write about what I experience when I get into bed and I'm really tired. My bed is cool and comfortable. I feel relaxed and safe there. This is the straightforward prose statement that I have chosen to use. As you can see, it is extremely ordinary and communicates a straightforward idea. The next step is to pay close attention to what you wrote. What you need to do now is to brainstorm your idea. Jot down as many ideas as you can think of about your topic. Now, let's see what I can come up with. And while I'm doing this, why don't you try jotting down ideas about your poem? The sheets are smooth and soothing. My bones melt into the mattress. These are only a few ideas about my topic. With greater thought, it would be possible to formulate an entire page of ideas associated with our initial statement. Our next step is to concentrate and think of new ways of presenting your original statement. Remember that originality is an important aspect of the creative process. If we write something that we have read somewhere before, or we use a description that we have heard before, our poem has less impact and the reader might become bored. So our next step aims to create maximum originality. Write down potential poetic lines to express your ideas, paying attention to originality. As you do this, it is essential to avoid using clichés. Do you know what a cliché is? A cliché is an overused statement. It is boring and unoriginal. So when you are writing something and anything sounds familiar or secondhand, reject that. These original phrases help the reader to create a clear image in his or her mind. Now, did you manage to come up with some incredibly creative original images for your poem? Sometimes it might take quite a while to get the exact idea to express your feelings perfectly. But it is well worth the effort, and I'm sure you will be proud of yourself when you get it right. But now it's time to put our ideas and images into the form of a poem. Rewrite your ideas using as few words as possible. By using 2 different forms of poetry, we will determine which one is best for our subject. Now let's start by looking at this example of a rhyming poem. Bones melting into sheets as smooth as homemade vanilla ice cream. I slowly sink into a sweet dream. I'm not too happy with this second part of the poem. The words, I slowly sink into a sweet dream, sounds boring and as if I was trying too hard to think of a rhyming word. I think that I need to reassess that part. I'm going to try and write a free verse poem because clearly trying to make the words in my poem rhyme is not working too well. Now, do you know what free verse poetry is? Now, unlike structured poetry, where you have, for instance, every second line rhyming, free verse has no set structure. By the way, can you see how self-criticism and reflection is an essential part of writing poetry? Now let's try looking at it again. This is my final free verse poem. Aching and tired, I sink into bed, grateful. Bones melting into sheets smooth as homemade vanilla ice cream. If your poem still has quite a number of words that you believe you can leave out, then keep on editing until you have concentrated your idea. Now let's take another look at how we wrote this poem. Write down a straightforward statement. Pay close attention to what you wrote. Concentrate and think of new ways of presenting your original statement. Write down potential poetic lines to express your ideas, paying attention to originality. Write your ideas using as few words as possible. Writing poetry is fun and it can be an extremely satisfying way of expressing yourself. But don't be fooled into thinking that it just flows from some divine inspiration. Most poems took hard work and sweat to produce. But never underestimate your own skills. You might be South Africa's next great poet. Thanks for joining me today. Bye-bye.